Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to have lots of tips on how to draw realistic fur in graphite on a recent Cocker Spaniel drawing that I completed. Now as always, the first thing I like to start off with is the eye, and as you can see here I'm building up my values in stages. If the eye is fairly dark on the outer edges, I'll usually start with a HB and then gradually increase those darker layers as I go. Now that is my preference rather than starting with my darkest pencil first, even if that area is really dark. Now there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is jumping in with the softest, darkest graphite pencils too early on can cause more graphite shine. The other is that I like to build it up in stages as I feel I'm able to then use my erasers and build up those layers more gradually to enhance that depth, which is lacking if I use just one solid darker layer. Now onto the fur. The base layer here for me is really important, and in all of my graphite drawings I use graphite powder. Now graphite powder I like to either use a paper blending stump or an eye makeup applicator to apply that, but all I'm doing with that stage is blocking in where the main lights and darks are. You can see that when I come back in with my graphite pencils, I'm then refining that layer of my graphite powder, really working to enhance that contrast. Now contrast is something that I feel is really important with any medium. It doesn't matter if it's colour or grayscale. It's the values and that contrast that help to capture that shape and form. Now a great example of that is here around the eye. You can see that I'm now building up my darker values, and this is hinting at the eye socket and where the cheek is. Now one thing that is really important when mapping in the lights and the darks is the placement. Now the highlights and shadows here around the eye are not random, so if this darker area that I'm currently working on was a little bit too tall and it was too much closer to the top edge of the paper, I'm actually going to raise that eye socket. I'm going to potentially give that expression where it's raising one of the eyebrows, and eventually if it's over exaggerated too much, the top of the skull and the head there will actually end up too big, even though the outside proportions might be correct. If the highlights and shadows are not in the right place, it will adjust the shape of the skull underneath the fur. So this is something that I really want to be paying attention to. Now something else that is just as important as the placement of the highlights and shadows is the fur direction. This is something that can also impact the shape and form of the subject. So for example here where I'm curving my pencil strokes over from the darker section of the eye socket, if I don't get that curve right and it's too much of a straighter line, then that is also going to make it look like the top of the head is too tall. If I overcompensate and make that curve too exaggerated so that it slopes really quickly down towards the lower right corner, for example, then that will actually make the face look more narrow than it should be. So getting both of these aspects right, I feel does make a big difference to how realistic the end portrait will be. Now another aspect with pencil technique that is important is the length of the pencil strokes. So this of course is going to vary depending on the fur texture that we are drawing, but for a Cocker Spaniel here I want to be making sure that I've got more of those shorter to medium pencil strokes, but that they're not too long, especially on the face. Now the fur directly around the eyes is likely going to be a little bit shorter than the fur on the top of the head. So I want to be making sure that I'm always adjusting the length of my pencil strokes and that they are not too short that would replicate something like a Jack Russell. So it is important to get that balance correct when we're aiming for this high level of realism. Now the last thing with pencil technique is the thickness of the pencil strokes. This with graphite is going to be determined by how sharp your lead is on the pencil and how you're holding and moving the pencil, combined with the amount of pressure that's being applied. Now this is something that I do focus thoroughly in the real-time tutorials. Where I explain everything in the moment while I'm drawing, I'm able to really cover every aspect of the drawing in the moment so that I'm able to make it more step by step. Being able to explain things as I'm drawing, it can really help to make even the more complex subjects easier to tackle, because there might be tiny little alterations with the technique that are only apparent in that drawing process that could potentially be forgotten once the voiceover was added separately. So here my preference for the real-time tutorials is to add that while I'm drawing. If you are interested in any of my step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. I've got lots of different subjects. I upload wildlife and pet portraits there so that we've got a range of techniques, different fur types to draw. If you do have any art related questions, if you're working on a portrait, you're not quite sure how to progress, or there's a specific technique you're struggling with, feel free to pop any questions in the comments below and I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now, a quick tip when drawing realistic noses, and this would also apply for eyes as well, is if you do have a really bright highlight in the top section of the nose or where the nostrils curve over, that's usually the two places where those highlights are going to be at its brightest. If they are really light, then allowing the white of the paper to show through there and not adding graphite all over the nose would be one of those things to ensure that that highlight is going to be as bright as it possibly can be. We can always darken that up later on if needed, but having the white of the paper visible there just means that we take that pressure off, that we know that it cannot physically be any brighter. Now, the base layer here for the muzzle area is exactly the same process. I'm using a little paper blending stump just to map in some of that graphite powder and then coming back in with my pencils. And again, I'm starting with sort of like a HB type pencil, and then I'll gradually increase my layers as I go. Even if there was a darker marking, let's say I was drawing a Dalmatian, I don't want to jump into my darkest pencil for the spots and then end up with that area of the fur looking flat and then building up more layers on the whiter fur. It just could potentially make it look like some of the other areas of the fur are lacking in depth, which can bring down the rest of the portrait. Now, for Dalmatian markings, I do have a little fur study tutorial of a Dalmatian's ear, and I can link that also in the description below if it's of interest, and I'll show you there the way that I like to approach that kind of unique marking as well. Now, all of the key aspects with pencil technique I'm applying here, but this is where my pencil strokes are shorter. So because the fur around the muzzle on Cocker Spaniels and Springer Spaniels are usually much shorter here, it's something that I do like to get right. By lengthening the fur there too much, I'm going to make this part of the face look quite fluffy. Now, of course, if it was a cockapoo and that kind of breed, the longer pencil strokes would work well. But for something like this, I do want to keep them shorter. Now, that is also going to be affected by how big the portrait is. So this was only A4, which is about an 8x12. So the size of the dog's face in relation to that was on the smaller scale. So I need to be making sure then that I'm not forcing too much detail in these smaller areas, because that can actually make the fur look wiry. Now, if I was doing this on a much larger scale, 16x24 inches, then I'd be able to add in lots of tiny little details in all of the areas of the drawing, because the area that I'd be working on would be significantly larger. But usually the smaller portraits are more popular, so I need to be making sure here that I am really getting the balance right with contrast and the amount of detail that's added. There is loads of detail here, but it's not too much that it makes those pencil strokes or eraser highlights look too wiry. And as I've said, this can happen fairly quickly if more of them are added. It's one of those situations where less is more. If we have that tendency to force in more of that detail, we're either going to cover up too much of our lighter layers underneath, or we're going to use the erasers too much and then the darker layers end up too bright, which will affect the overall contrast when the portrait is finished. So the black sections of the fur here would actually end up more of a grey if I'm trying to add in too many highlighted details and lifting up too much of that darker base. Now at this stage here, it's really tempting to add the whiskers. I would always leave those till the last layer, because if I did want to come back in and make any alterations here, I'm going to have to work around the whiskers, and that is far more time consuming, really fiddly, and it can make the drawing process far more stressful. So leaving those at the end, I'm going to then start working on the ears. Now, spaniel ears is probably one of the more difficult fur textures to draw in any medium. Now, in order to simplify that, I like to use, again, my graphite powder, and I'm simply looking at the shapes that I can see. I'm first of all focusing on the darker shadows, and then I can start to really make more sense of that area rather than working with one solid layer of graphite. Once I've done that, I'm going to again repeat that process, but this time with my graphite pencils. I'm coming in, enhancing where the placement of the darker areas are, so that when I look back at my reference photo, back at my drawing, I can make sense a bit more easily where I am. I do find this makes a real difference with more complex textures. It doesn't just have to be spaniel fur. If there was a feather, a specific pattern in the feather that was difficult, I would map in the lights and the darks, simplify that, and then it makes it less overwhelming and then much easier to draw. Now what you can see here is where I am increasing the darker layers in stages, I'm allowing the lighter graphite powder in some places to still show through. This is actually acting as my midtones and eventually my highlights when I start working with my erasers. Now this is another reason why I love working with graphite powder, because the complexity of the ear here would be far more overwhelming if I knew that I was going to have to fight to put those lighter highlights in place. Whereas working with building up those darker stages, you can see even here I'm enhancing those highlights by making those darker areas even darker. It automatically makes those highlights in the fur appear lighter, yet I haven't used an eraser yet. So building up these stages here gradually, I think can just not only simplify that process, but it certainly makes it less overwhelming. So that when I come back in with my Tombow mono eraser here, you can see those erasers lift up really well. There's no fighting with that process because I've built up those stages gradually. This is something that I feel is so important with any drawing in graphite. That overwhelming feeling of working with a darker fur and then not being able to pull our highlights in on top, I think is what results in that confidence of not going dark enough. So if the darker fur is too light, as I said before, the overall contrast will be lacking and the portrait will look flat. But building up the stages here, it's always then making it possible that those highlights can be put in place with the erasers without having to then compromise on the contrast. The same process is going to apply for the other ear. The real difference would be in a reference photo, if it does have a stronger one-sided light source, there may be brighter highlights or darker shadows on one ear compared to the other. So I always want to be judging how bright are the highlights on this ear compared to the other ear. If the lighting is more overall and it's more of a front light source, it might be fairly equal. But if there is a one-sided light source, it's really important to capture that. Now the fur details on the edge of the subject that overlap the white of the background, I want to be making sure that I've also got those accurate. You can see here that they change direction. There is a variation in the length of them as well. This will ensure that your drawing doesn't look like a sticker that's been cut out and just stuck on the paper. But it's also important not to over-exaggerate them either, because that fur could then look too fluffy, it could look significantly longer. You know, it might just change a little bit more of that realistic texture for that one animal that we're drawing. Onto the chest, this is one of those areas where it's important to make sure that it's not rushed. I know that when I was newer in my drawing process and especially taking on commissions, this is the one area that I felt probably didn't get the right amount of time compared to the face. I'd maybe spend multiple days working on the face of the animal and then only an hour or two on the chest. This can then bring down the entire portrait, so it's really important that this area of the drawing gets as much attention as everywhere else. Now, of course, depending on the complexity of this area, it might be that it doesn't require the same amount of time. You might have lots of complex markings on the face and the area on the body is a little bit more of a plainer fur type. That would be okay as long as it still reaches the same level of realism. I just want to be making sure here that it's up to the same standard, regardless of the colour or the markings in the fur. Now this portrait was a little different in that this dog was actually wearing a bandana, so I am working with this harsher edge at the bottom. This is deliberate for this stage. However, if I was working on a head and shoulder type portrait, I always prefer to either draw the body right to the bottom edge of the paper or potentially fade it out at the head and shoulder so that I don't have this harsh edge at the bottom. I just feel that it doesn't really flow as nicely, but of course this is personal preference. There's no right or wrong way of working. If you do feel like it's a little bit too harsh, then you can take a paintbrush with a little bit of graphite powder, maybe even a sponge tool like a soft tool or an eye makeup applicator, and again use a bit of graphite powder to fade that edge. I show that in a few of my real-time tutorials as well. Now I want to be making sure that when I'm drawing fabric that I've got the right amount of detail, and again this is something that I've already mentioned a few minutes ago. This bandana had quite a complex pattern, but I wasn't able to add in everything with how small these areas were. So again, if I was working significantly larger, I'd have that space to add in more of that delicate pattern. But for this, I needed to just tone that down a little bit and get the balance of my contrast and the pattern right. So my main priority is going to be the contrast. I want to make sure that I've got the softness of that fabric in place. And as you can see here, the edges of the lights and the darks are well blended. That's going to make sure that it doesn't look too flat and two-dimensional. Now the same tip would apply here for other areas of the fur, and that is the placement of the highlights and shadows. As you can see here, this on its own as it is starting to look like creased up fabric because of how I'm building up my values. I'm not having to worry about any complex pattern because the contrast is giving that texture for me. So I do want to make sure that I've got that right. But at this stage, once I've got my base foundation of my lights and darks established, loving the use of the graphite powder for this, I can then come back in with my erasers and then add that pattern on top. Now I prefer this kind of layering approach for patterns on fabric rather than using my graphite pencils and actually drawing around the patterns themselves, only because I feel that that approach can actually make the fabric look more harsh just because the pencils have been applied for the patterns themselves. There's no right or wrong way of working, and each reference photo or scenario might require a different technique, but for the most part, the graphite powder, really focusing on the values first and then adding in the pattern on top, is going to, I feel, make that drawing process much easier. So onto the chest, this is where I've mentioned that I do like to fade out the pet portraits, so I'm looking to just lighten my values as I get a little bit lower to the edge. The last inch and a half or so is where I like to get a little bit more of that faded effect. Now if I was working with a darker fur colour, I would definitely be using more of my graphite powder for the lower edge and blending that into the white of the paper. That will help just to create a little bit more softness. But because this fur on the body was white, I was able to use that with the white of the paper to help create that softness initially. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in any of my step-by-step lessons, I'll link the information to those in the description below. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.